everybody. Welcome back to CMN 153. This is our class for Thursday the 20th, and believe it or not, we are getting towards the ending of the semester. We have 1 week left, actually. We are finishing up with class on Tuesday, where we are talking about digital gaming on the 25th. And then finally, we end on Thursday, and that would be the day that your final course project would be due. Though some of you have already started handing those in, so thank you for that. And the 27th is also when I will be posting our final examination. And you'll have a 48-hour time period in order to be able to finish that particular final exam. Basically, what you will be doing is choosing from a series of essay questions and choosing a couple of essay questions and responding several paragraphs in length. It's open book, open notes, which is what I would have done if we were meeting in class live. So basically, you can use any resources that you'd like. You can use the textbook. You can use any or all of the journals that you've been writing over the course of the semester. That's one of the reasons why you've been writing these journals, so that you can access that information. And the exam would have taken approximately 3 hours or so if we were taking it in class. So that's how much time you should set aside for this particular exam, approximately 3 hours, give or take a little bit. And then you can submit in that exam to me, and then basically I will determine final grades, and then you should be able to access them on my GCC, but if not, you can always contact me and I can send you what your final grade is as well. So if you've got any late or outstanding work, I'm willing to accept that late or outstanding work, but do know that the semester ends in a week. So where we are talking about sound recording and popular music, you can see that in the notes I've posted a bit of history with some important dates, starting with the 1800s, the 1850s to be exact, is when the French began making some experiments with sound recordings. It wasn't until 1877, however, that an American, which I suspect you've heard of, Thomas Edison, was able to record his own voice. And that led also to him patenting the phonograph, which used foil cylinders to capture audio. In 1887, the Germans were able to develop flat discs in order to record voices and audio, and that replaced the foil cylinders. And they patented that as the gramophone, and this was the beginning of mass production. In 1906, Victor talking machine basically came into play, or the Victrola, where phonographs and radios were put into large pieces of furniture. And if you think about part of what we saw with War of the Worlds, with family gathered around in a living room looking at a large piece of furniture where they were getting the broadcast of War of the Worlds, that was pretty much the situation until television basically came and took that place. It's been oftentimes called the electronic hearth. That one of the reasons why television is so captivating is because of the flickering images that perhaps can mimic something like a campfire, which goes all the way back to our hunter-gatherer days. And many have said that computer screens and mobile devices that basically supplanted that mobile or that electronic hearth in a mobile way. But at any rate, in the 1930s is when we're beginning to get magnetic audio tapes. So now we've got more convenient forms of being able to capture audio. This led to improved sound editing, improved sound in general, and multi-tracking. The 1940s is when these wax and shellac discs were replaced with vinyl. So if you think about the vinyl of today's records, which also led to improved audio and longer playing times. So you could get approximately 20 minutes or so on each side of vinyl. 1950s is when we're getting multi-track recordings, so multiple tracks can be recorded at the same time. So we've got further complexities with music. And the 1960s allowed miniaturized audio tapes to be put into something called cassettes. And that also led to something called home dubbing. And I don't know if any of you have any memories of home dubbing or not, but I do. And trying to capture a piece of music from the radio onto a cassette tape and making my own mixtape. In the 1970s is where we get digital recording. So now music is becoming much more sophisticated. We've got the binary zeros and ones or on-off pulses in order to be able to record music, which led to the compact disc or CDs of 1980s. That said, it was thought that the CD would basically lead to the death of the vinyl record. That didn't necessarily happen. There has been a resurgence in vinyl. Part of it is nostalgia, but part of it is sound quality. There's a certain level of rawness on vinyl that you really can't get in a digital sort of format on a CD. The 1990s, as we've talked about with just about every media form, has led to convergence. The 1990s is where we led to the birth of the internet, and all media basically had to adapt itself to the internet. In terms of music, what was happening in the 1990s were illegal internet sharing downloads of MP3s, which were compressed digital recordings. What that led to in the 2000s were business models that would allow individuals to access these MP3s, but to do so with some sort of a pay system in place. iTunes, if you are familiar with the iPod, and how important that was really in the 2000s, that you could have this personalized music library that was mobile. But that said, in the 2010s, we developed streaming, and that completely upended that business model. Rather than owning music, you would have access to music either through a subscription or through advertising, supported financing, or a combination of the two. This led to the growth of things like independent music labels and internet self-uploads. You think about the way that musicians no longer have to depend on these major record companies in order to record their music or to distribute their music. And YouTube, among many internet sites, become a major player in terms of being able to allow musicians to expose their music to a wider range of audience members. In terms of music, I wanted to focus on pop music. And pop or popular music is supposed to represent a wide cross-section of the population. And it began in the early to mid 1900s with show tunes and vocal ballads. You might have heard of Frank Sinatra, who had established himself as a crooner, and this was the language that was used for individuals who were singing these kinds of vocal ballads. From about the 1920s to the 1940s or so was the heyday of jazz. Not to say that jazz still isn't important. You think about names like Louis Armstrong. And jazz is very interesting because it is improvised and it's from the African American community. In fact, it could be seen as the only musical form that's truly American. In the 1950s, we get rock and roll. And rock and roll was a blues slang term for sex, and it was seen as a music that was highly dangerous and highly suggestive. And if you've heard of, and I can't imagine that you haven't, Elvis Presley, who established his reputation with that. Or even someone like Little Richard, because this music wasn't just integrationist, as we saw with Elvis Presley, but it was also androgynous, and this was the beginning of some of the androgynous movement that came afterwards, starting with Little Richard and then moving to people like David Bowie later on. The 1960s is oftentimes known as an incredibly powerful decade for music because there were lots of things going on in the 60s. One being the British invasion, and this is where you've got the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and both of them achieved fame basically by doing covers from black musicians. So there's a long tradition, unfortunately, in the music industry of a certain level of racism and discrimination, as we can see with some of the successes and failures of musical artists. This was also the time of folk music, music that was much less polished and also was much more socially directed and politically directed. If you've ever heard of Joan Baez, 60s, very tumultuous time in terms of some of the social norms of our society being questioned, and also the height of an unpopular war, Vietnam War. This is also the time of psychedelic music, in other words, music being linked with things like drugs and alcohol. So if you think about something like Jimi Hendrix, a dark culture. In fact, in 1969, it probably came to a head with Woodstock, which was at a New York dairy farm, which is perhaps the most famous music festival that exists in music history, as it was promoted of 3 days of peace and music. As we move to the 1970s to the 1980s, we begin getting some backlash to the idea that rock and roll is no longer cutting edge, but it's more commercialized. This led to things like punk rock. So if you know about the Ramones or Blondie, for instance, direct opposition to rock's commercialism. And much of that happened in a bar in New York City called CBGB. The 1980s to the present, hip-hop has had a major influence. It began probably with the rap hit by the Sugar Hill Gang, and that was in the 1970s. But we think about the progress of hip-hop, urban rapping and sampling. If I had to identify one rapper, I would identify Run DMC, who had the first hip-hop gold record in 1984. And hip-hop also being very controversial in that it oftentimes addressed social and political agendas, but oftentimes could be seen as racist or sexist, and perhaps both at the same time. The 1990s, very much defined by the idea of grunge, and this was very much an anti-fashion movement with some messy guitar sounds. Nirvana, probably best associated with that particular form of music. The 2000s, and it's less about music and it's more about the creation of music. If you've ever heard of Max Martin, a Swedish individual who is a pop songwriter for many of the popular musicians in our time period, and has led to lots of number one hits. In fact, he has a formula that is oftentimes used in the creation of these hits. So there's a certain level of predictability to it. I actually have a video at the ending of this for you to watch that talks a little bit about how pop music in the last 20 years or so has become much more formulaic and much less creative. When we get to the 2010s, it probably is the decade of the female pop artists. When you think about Adele, you think about Taylor Swift, you think about Rihanna, and not only their incredible popularity, but their incredible power and the independent control that they exert over their careers, in part because the internet, as discussed earlier, allowed for lots of independent music labels and independent self-publishing. So what I thought I would do is, at least according to Billboard's top artists, and Billboard is a very respected way of measuring music popularity, at least according to 2019, what they did is they listed the greatest of all time artists based on record sales. And this may or may not surprise you, but I have a link for all of them. But the top group would be the Beatles. The top male singer, at least according to them, would be Elton John. Top female singer, at least according to them, would be Mariah Carey. Though if you look at other lists, and as we talked about with film and best of lists, as we were debating whether Citizen Kane should be at the top of the best, and even if it's possible to rank something as best. There's lots of debate involved with this. But at least in terms of being able to generate profits, the music industry has a completely different model now. It's much less likely that individuals will be purchasing music, and much more likely that what they will be doing is streaming music. But in terms of thinking about the kind of impact that some of these popular musical genres have had, Elvis Presley in particular, and this was a performance that he did on the Milton Berle show in the 1950s, and it was his Hound Dog performance, which was considered absolutely scandalous, in part because of his movements, his hip movements. In fact, when he appeared on other shows afterwards, for instance, the Ed Sullivan Show, they were instructed to film him only from the waist up because they thought that his hip movements were much too suggestive. But that particular performance is historical because of the outcry that resulted afterwards about music becoming much too sexual. So I wanted you to read an article about that, which I have posted in our notes, and also a clip of that very famous performance as well. Another famous musical group, the Beatles, led to something called Beatlemania, and it's hard to express the kind of hysteria, and I use that word deliberately, hysteria, associated with this particular group. and people were fainting in crowds, and police officers needed to be called for crowd control. And I have a little clip for you to view to get a sense as to the kind of hysteria that they were able to generate, often with adolescent girls, but not necessarily just adolescent girls. As I had indicated earlier, the time period where we are now is that, whether we realize it or not, Max Martin has created many of the hits that are played on the radio and that we probably listen to. And I wanted to give you a little bit of a YouTube video that talks about his formula and how he goes about creating music, and how many musical artists have used his formula to be successful. But when I was thinking about the importance of music, there is a direct correlation with music in adolescence. Specifically, the music of one's adolescence tends to be particularly powerful. And there's an article that talks a little bit about this that I've included for you to read. I have my own ideas and thoughts as to why I think the music of one's adolescence is so particularly powerful. And I thought that might be an interesting attendance question for you to talk about today. And that will be in our class discussion forum. And that will be asking you, which musical artist or group did you, or do you, if you're still in your adolescence, find to be the most powerful in relation to your adolescent experience, and why? And again, you could be in your adolescence right now, or your adolescence could be something that you're reflecting upon as having happened in the past. But I can just about guarantee that most people have a very strong hold to the music that they listened to when they were in their teens. And there are lots of variables associated with that. So I'd be very curious to know which music that is for you and why you found it to be so incredibly powerful. As we get towards the ending of the semester, as I had indicated, we're going to finish up next class with digital gaming. And then the following class will be for you doing something with your final project, hopefully submitting it in before that class, but certainly by next Thursday at the latest. And also the final examination. And I'm hopeful that our attendance questions that you've been answering, not just answering, but hopefully reading the responses of your classmates, can also assist you with things like a final exam. So I hope you're well. I'm doing well. I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say about music. I will be in our Zoom room today at 12, or 12:30, I should say, from 12:30 to 1, and then we'll finish up next week. But of course, you can always contact me on your own with questions and concerns. And I believe it was last class where I had put up a site for Purdue OWL, which should be helpful to you if it turns out that you are needing to document information for your final project. But of course, you can always contact me as well, and I can assist you with that. Take care. Bye-bye.